Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 20 of Impactful Conversations, a platform to educate and inspire. We're back again after a short production break, and I'm thrilled to have a special guest with us today. But before I introduce him, I would like to welcome you, the viewer and the listener, to the show. Thank you very much for all the wonderful support, and to all of you that have subscribed. Thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful support. And if you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to do that on your favorite platform, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, Google Podcasts. We're soon coming to Amazon Podcasts as well, and then also on YouTube as well. So yeah, we're currently on YouTube, so you can subscribe to the channel there. We've got some awesome content coming up for you, both in this episode that's coming up now, as well as in the next few weeks. Just to chat about what we've got coming up, the Street Smart Skills for Your Corporate Career course was the inception of Impactful Conversations courses. That's kickstarting in exactly 2 weeks from now, from the day that we're recording this. And it's for anybody that wants to gain practical tips on, making your mark in your corporate career or your job, no matter what the industry. And that's if you're working, if you just started in the workplace, or if you aspire to be in the workplace. It's hosted by a digital engineer in artificial intelligence and author of the book called Street Smart Skills for Your Corporate Career. So to sign up, head over to impactfulconversations.co.za. And thank you so much to all of you who've signed up so far. We're really overwhelmed by the number of people that have signed up. But now for the moment that you've all been waiting for, I'm delighted to welcome into the virtual room with me, Melvyn Lubega. Melvyn, before I introduce you, or before I greet you, let me first introduce you to the listeners and the viewers. So, okay, get ready for this. So, Melvyn is an actuary by training and is an experienced tech entrepreneur and business executive who's built businesses that serve customers across the world. He's a reference thought leader and invited speaker, both abroad and locally, on digital transformation, disruptive innovation, the future of the workforce, as well as business strategy. He's the founding executive and current director of Go1, a world leader in online training that has been recognized on both the Deloitte Fast500 list of the world's fastest growing companies, as well as the Disrupt 100 list of the world's most disruptive companies as well. He's also a non-executive director of Adcorp Group very recently as well. Following his graduate studies at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, he founded Go1, which currently serves clients in more than 20 countries. And prior to that, he worked for Boston Consulting Group, where he was their first associate in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as for Goldman Sachs in the UK. My only gripe with Melvyn is that he's a St. John's College old boy. So we're actually traditionally enemies. So that's actually how we met. But Melvyn, thank you so much for joining. How are you doing this afternoon?
No, doing well, Nataf. Great to be here and great to be able to speak to you and the listeners as well.
No, awesome. Thank you so much for joining on episode 20 of Impactful Conversations. It's great to have you here. Melvyn, typically I start off, with the guests. I already know you, but for those of the guests who don't know you, let's get to know you a little bit better. Where are you from? What are you passionate about? Yeah, tell us where you're born, where you grew up, and what are you passionate about as well?
Oh, awesome. I often say I'm a child of the continent. So born and raised in South Africa, Johannesburg, but I have strong roots in Uganda, as my parents grew up and were born in Uganda. And so I feel like I'm a bit of a son of the soil across the continent. But I guess when I think of my conception of the world and some of my early and formative years, definitely very much South Africa and Johannesburg. And in my later professional career, spent a bit more time abroad in the US, Australia, the UK, building out some of our businesses.
Awesome. We're gonna dive a little bit into that, but let's dive right in. So let's get to it. Right, I want to talk about your career. So talk to me a little bit about let's start it off. Your studies first. Why actuarial sciences and statistics? What led you to make that choice?
Yeah, it was an interesting one at the time, and so, coming from, I think, quintessential African family, my parents' generation, when you were smart, you became a doctor, and that was it. That was all. I mean, even anybody else was like, okay, fine, you couldn't be a doctor, so you became I won't mention other degrees because I'm trying to save the peace here. But let's just say there were others that fell in line thereafter. And it's interesting where so my older brother was a doctor, grandfather was a doctor, my father was a doctor. So lots of my mother also a vet, but also a doctor by term. Sister and I, other rogues, that sort of things. But for me, when it came down to thinking through career path, I asked myself, for studying rather, what did I enjoy? And so I've always enjoyed a quantitative approach to problem solving, particularly around mathematics. And so I knew I wanted to do something that was quantitative. But in the same vein, I also wanted to do something related to finance, because for a brief time I did financial mathematics in high school. I thought like it was something I quite like. And so for me, I was thinking through different courses. So I thought of engineering, and engineering for me was tough because there were so many different types of engineering, and they're also different. And so outside it, I couldn't make a choice. Whereas for me, I knew look, on the commerce side of things, it was a pure, am I doing accounting or am I doing actuarial science? And that was almost the lens which I looked at things. And again, not trying to start beef here, but in digging deeper, I found that accounting was primarily about looking at things that happened in the past, whereas actuarial science was taking your understanding of today and trying to predict the future and model risks and events. And so I thought to myself, actuarial science would be a good quantitative, financial, and commerce-related skill set to help me understand the world as a lens. And I like the way it's about long-term thinking. And back then I used to have an opinion that if you had the right data points, anything could be predicted or modeled. I still believe that to be true, but I still struggle to think that, because of X, therefore Y in every instance. But those are some of the views I held as a younger man.
Thank you for that, Melvyn. Yeah, so you participated, heavily in student leadership in your time at university. So tell me a little bit about how your leadership style formed through this, and I guess also evolved, after having been, head of school at St. John's College as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. When I think back to my leadership journey, in hindsight, it can look like, okay, no, Melvyn was head boy. I was head boy in my primary school. I was head boy at St. John's. I was head of my residence at GCT. Did SRC. Was head of the presidents of the African Society at Oxford. So you can easily look back and be like, Melvyn's that guy that solves for that stuff. But I wish I could say that it was more so. I always found myself in communities or groups where I just wanted to serve those communities and serve that group, and almost found that through that service and wanting to serve it better, I found myself in leadership positions. And so I guess over the years, though, my leadership style has honed, and I even say more so now in my professional career, where I'm at the point where the leadership style typically of people in the leadership of the organization determine the culture, determine certain norms in the organization. And so if I think about the journey, it's always been around serving, and it still remains the same today. And I think I've been fortunate to have increasingly bigger communities to serve. But also, most importantly, I think I've been very fortunate to have phenomenally strong team members. And it's something which I always sit back and just reflect on in life, just the blessings I've been able to have. I mean, I think of my prefect body in matric at St. John's, where just, my deputy head boys, counterbalanced me. Just really strong teams, and that's been able to shine. I think of my house committee when I was in Kapana at UCT. Again, phenomenal group of individuals. All of us who relate to different people differently, had different skills, but collectively we were really strong. And even today, if I think about the time we spent in GoOn, where, if you think of the founding team at GoOn, so you got me and Actuary, Andrew is an economist, Chris is a lawyer, other Chris is a computer scientist, and Vu's a medical doctor. And just that different perspective in terms of approaching problems, but still have a unified approach to leadership, I think has been quite beneficial. And so I guess where I am now, it's very much as a leader, always asking myself the question, how can I enable those I lead to be their best selves and for them to live lives of purpose? And so something I always tell my team, especially the hiring managers within the teams, is that it's your job to make sure the people who you hire are successful in the organization. And so if you take with that particular approach and extrapolate that elsewhere, you find that you're able to keep a good, true north when you think about decisions and actions.
And is that how you would describe your current sort of leadership style at the moment?
I definitely would say that. I think it's different, I think of days in high school when you'd be standing in front of the school before first team rugby match and you're getting the crowd riled up, ready to take the hill, as it were. I think it always comes down to providing leadership and guidance. And I think it's something which I reflect on a lot, particularly now during the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, where, it's uncertain times. And so often, a leader can have a vision of where they want to go and know, like, look, because of experience is where you want to be. But I think what the pandemic taught me as well is just the importance of, as a leader, one, to take care of yourself, but also just the power of transparency and making sure everyone's on the same page in communication. So, everyone knows, like, look, this is how good or bad things are, and therefore making these decisions, or just giving someone a true sense. Because if you aren't able to build that trust with the people that you lead, and they don't understand why you do what you do, I think you won't have positive outcomes, both individually and collectively. And so for me, I think it definitely has translated to my leadership style today, though I can definitely say it's been almost somewhat nuanced or honed and finessed through varied experiences, both good and bad.
And if I had to build on that, who are your biggest influences? Not influencers, but influences.
I've got to be like, so if I go into Instagram and I see who follows me, I would say that.
But I'm talking about people that I guess we can talk about people that you've met and got to know. I'd also be curious to know maybe one person that you haven't met as well, that you have been sort of positively influenced by.
Yeah. So something which I've come to appreciate, and so just for so my mother was a single parent. My father passed away when I was relatively young, when I was 8 in a car accident, and so it wasn't really a big father figure in the house per se. But I think definitely the legend of my dad has been inspiration for me in my life, even as a young boy. And I think at that level, just even reflecting on his journey, and so he was a medical doctor, but heavily involved in politics, was involved in the ANC, in leadership levels when I was growing up here. Even though as a foreigner, I got stuck in from the day he came in for back in the 80s. And so just in terms of just how he was a leader, business person, he got scholarships to all the schools he ever went to, was fortunate to get a scholarship to study in the UK, was again head boy in all these schools. And so that created an example for me of look, and no one's perfect, but in the same vein, just saying look, you don't necessarily need to box yourself in. And if you're given gifts, you can make them work. But I definitely say ever since then, particularly in my professional career, I've been very fortunate to have people, if I think about my housemasters at St. John's, people who are mentors of mine, lecturers that are still now colleagues and friends who've spoken into my life. But I'd say people I've learned the most from and I influenced my life have been people that I haven't met. And just because I really enjoy reading biographies, particularly autobiographies, just to realize I like ones that are raw, because often for me, I don't care about the outcome of decision. I care about the decision quality. So what was someone thinking about when they made that decision? So, I mentioned to you earlier, Adrian Go, someone I respect. Again, he was saying look, their decisions aren't normally distributed, and it's often only, one or two decisions in your life that actually have an outsized impact. And so just some of the ones I've read I really enjoyed. I was listening audiobook to so Steven Schwartzman, so the founder of BlackRock, Blackstone, and just about his journey, where in hindsight it seems like it was all romantic, but just going through the tribulations with him in those journeys have been very impactful. And so I've been very fortunate to be influenced by people like that and mentors I've had in my life. To your question though, people who I haven't met, who I'd like to meet. So something which I quite like is I believe that no company can have the impact, especially in an African context, the impact of a government or someone at public policy level. And so someone who I highly respect is, for his journey at least, is someone like Michael Bloomberg, just because, he became a captain of industry, built the respect of people in his community, yes, the bankers in New York and so forth, with the work they did building up Bloomberg, also made his wealth, accumulated his wealth, and then took the path of wanting to give back to society, and first to his community, which was then New York, as mayor of New York. And I think for me, I quite like that journey of, building up a skill, building up value, and entering the fray of politics or public policy or public discourse from a place of being a value adding actor and being able to collaborate across spheres. And so it's something which I firmly believe in. That's the power of public and private collaborations.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So we dive right in. Let's turn the temperature down a little bit right now. I know it's summer, so let's cool it down a little bit. So in back getting to know you some more, tell me a little bit about your daily routine. So what's a typical day in your life now? You know, let's say pre-level 1, I guess. 'Cause I know life is about to change back to a new normal, I guess. But also, you know, non-COVID pandemic daily routine. How different is it to your daily routine now?
You know, because, and this is where I feel like I maybe it may seem odd, but not much difference to some extent. Only because the bulk of my team in Go1, or the teams that we work with in Go1, are like outside of South Africa, and so they always are in odd time zones. That being said, I mean, so obviously we have an office here in Waterfall, and like we have a team here as well. But I did find like I was a remote worker or nomad for such a long period of time when we're building out the business that it hasn't changed too drastically. That being said, I mean, I'll answer your question directly, but I found, you know, in the beginning of lockdown, because I have meetings all over the place. You know, we do some stuff in agriculture, so we travel now and then to like the nether parts of South Africa, further away from the bigger cities like Johannesburg and so forth, and often traveling between meetings to meet clients, partners, and so forth in locally. And so before lockdown, I used to travel a fair bit, just to a few countries. But if I think about the daily routine, for me, typically it's interesting. I'd like to start the day with some of my colleagues in Australia, just because our 9 or 8 a.m. here is end of day in Australia. And so just being able to touch base with the guys, see where they're at, and have an earlier start with them. And then from there, transition to the South Africa day. Typically have like an all hands or check in with the local team, see what their priorities are, see how they're doing, if we clear any blockers for the day, any big things need to come through. And then just into like, you know, a series of meetings and getting things done in that way. During lockdown, I've tried to have like a 12 to 1 slot that I've blocked out where I call it lunch/workout. I think I probably had more lunch than workout in that gap, but I mean, the ambition was there in my vision board, and so I still keep it in there. And I get reminded all the time when I'm eating my lunch, being like, you should be working out right now. Oh, well. Then, you know, something which, and then afternoons, I typically try to minimize the number of meetings I have just because I actually need to try to get actual work out. Because also realize what happens to me for a very long time was I spend the whole day in meetings, and then typically our team in the US to be like, West Coast comes online late afternoon, early evening. So you join the day with them. And then by the time you want to start working, let's say it's now like, you know, 8, 9, 10. I mean, actual working is like actually not meeting, but actually sitting down and getting graphed out. I then find by midnight, the team in Australia is coming back online, which is 8 a.m. for them. And so now in the afternoon, I try to be intentional, some less so now during lockdown, just because I realize that time's flexible, to try and actually dedicated like 2 hours in my diary where I say like, look, this is my quiet time where I can actually get work done, as opposed to having meetings slotted in there. And so it has been a bit of a change, but reflecting on lockdown, I mean, early on, I felt like I was saving so much time because I wasn't traveling between meetings. And I was like, this is so productive. This is awesome. I'm going to change the world from my laptop. But then I started to like miss it. I started to like miss like, you know, not being able to like get in my car and drive somewhere. So I used to like get into my car, reverse out the driveway, like literally like 5 meters, take a call, and then like drive back in, just, you know, to feel like I was moving. This was
just
obviously
for a change.
But just for a change, mix it up, you know. Just I tried having like moving my desk one day to the garden, so just trying to mix it up because I realized, you know, whilst I like my house and my 4 walls and all that good stuff, I wanted to make sure that I was taking care of my mental health because whilst I realized I was very busy on calls and so forth, I wasn't giving myself that clear mental headspace to actually like look, mix things up. And so something which I realized during this time, just the importance of self-care and wellness, and so that affected the schedule somewhat, but from that perspective, try to balance out between work, you know, thinking time and also activity, just to ensure that I'm also being the best me I can be, so I can be the best leader and manager I need to be for my team.
And I think what you said is actually so important, right? That actually you almost need to deliberately make an effort to take care of yourself, right? Because yes, you created a lot of time, you know, by not traveling. But very easily it can become very destructive if you start, you know, overworking and not actually giving yourself enough time to rest and, you know, quite frankly, sleep as well, right? Because the days just, you know, mingle into one, and all of a sudden it's Sunday, and it's like, how did that happen?
So true, so true. Like I mean, like so, when I came back to South Africa a few years, like probably 3 years ago, a few friends and I started a development finance company where we used to like finance, invoice factor, and discount and help companies with their working capital needs. And so I was living down in Cape Town, and I was traveling up to Joburg probably like every single day, if not like, because there used to be an airline, a low cost airline, which I hope I didn't like make them bankrupt, but they had the service where you could pay like, I think it must have been like 8,000 Rand or 4,000 Rand for unlimited flights between Joburg and Cape Town. And I literally used to use it like an Uber. Like I would like just go up like one day, come down in the evening, go up the next, and I mean like it was really nice. But it was interesting, I guess then where I found that the 2-hour flight between Joburg and Cape Town was my most productive time in my week, just because it was like, you couldn't do anything else. There were no calls, no messages. You're offline. You can actually just get things done. And so the question is now, even without that travel, how do I create those spaces?
That's a great point. It's an absolutely brilliant point. Tell me a little bit about your fashion sense, right? I've been intrigued about this for quite some time. You have quite a unique fashion sense, right? So tell me a little bit about where that comes from.
So at a young age, and there are a few levels to it, and so maybe the fact, and you say intrigue could either be a positive or a negative. I'm going to lean into it, because summer's coming and it's happening. But I remember, so my dad was a guy that used to wear suits all the time. Like, when they say a gentleman knows no weather, I mean, that man was a G. Like, he was suit and tie through everything. And so he taught me how to tie a tie when I was very young. And so something which was always a hallmark of me was like trying to make sure that immaculate tie looked very sharp. But I definitely think where my style has definitely over the years improved was one when I began working with the Boston Consulting Group, where I was, so through obviously student governance, SRC, all that stuff, you're always wearing suits and ties. But in hindsight, I had very poor fitting suits that were always too big for me, given like my understanding of style now. But I always had a tie, and that sold for it. Yet, I remember when I began working in consulting, the first day I came there in a suit and tie, like I was ready, because I came from the banking and Goldman Sachs. I was like, suit and tie ready for war. And my partner at the time was like, no, to the like managing director was like, no, Melvyn, we don't wear ties here. If I can't want to see the tie, I keep one in the drawer and I take it out. And I was like, because something is to be said. When you wear different ties, you can wear the same color shirt, same color suit, but it mixes it up. Now when you have one less tie, all of a sudden I'm like, am I that guy who's only wearing white shirts and a blue suit? I've become that dude overnight. But it was quite fascinating actually working with, because I was as I mentioned, one of the first associates in Africa, and so we're building up the Africa side of the business. I think when I started, there were 5 of us sitting in the Regis office in Sandton, overlooking Nelson Mandela Square. And we used to work with lots of like fly-ins from Germany. And these German guys had the most immaculate fashion. Like they would like wear like the brightest like red chinos with like a crisp white shirt, brown shoes, and brown belt. And they just look on fleek. And I was like, you know what, guys? And I used to adapt pieces of that into my repertoire. And I think where it compounded was following my time, I never owned a pair of brown shoes until that point in time. Imagine a whole guy at the age of like 22, 23 had never owned a pair of brown shoes. Anyway, we live and we learn. And so it's funny because I remember for my 13th birthday, one of my mother's friends got me a brown belt, and I still wear this brown belt to today. And I got that for my birthday gift. In hindsight, I was younger then, so forgive me. I was like, how can this lady give me a brown belt? Who actually wants a brown belt? And literally that thing sat in my cupboard for at least 10 years. Now it's probably the belt I wear the most in my life. And so I'm very grateful for my aunt for that like investment she made in my life. And so I think when my fashion sense took a level up was actually probably my time in the UK, particularly in Oxford, where I think just one really good friend of mine, sorry, the most stylish guy I know, who just brought the heat. And it's a very good insight that he and I used to share and we agree on, where you can have the most expensive clothing, but if it doesn't fit you well, it doesn't matter. And so we were all students trying to hustle, make our scholarship money go further. But I think it just comes down to, one, how do you have a unique dress sense, but also how do you wear what makes sense for your body and for your style? And so right now, I'm not the most outlandish dresser, but I do feel as though I try to have a style that is unique. And also I feel like I'm very much grounded in Africa. And so I like to always have touches of Africa, whether it's a cheeky pocket square there or pendant that speaks to the continent. And so just trying to be authentic in that particular way. That being said, I mean, I remember when we went from Oxford to San Francisco to build out GoOn, and I went there with my tweed jackets from the UK and my bow ties, and you literally get to Silicon Valley. And I'm going to say this boldly. It's often a race to the bottom who can dress down. And so there I was with all my suits and things I've invested in. There, guys like wearing slops and t-shirts. These are like very wealthy, very successful tech people. And so I've also found that my dress sense has changed in my environment. I won't say I'm the quintessential tech entrepreneur because I do like to mix things up sometimes. But it's definitely, I'd say my dress sense is a function of my experiences to date.
I love that. Absolutely love that. And maybe next time you come back onto the show, you'll be a fashion influencer. So I look forward to that.
I receive. Like let me just receive it and take it.
So let's talk about Go1, right? I want us to dive into the founding steps of Go1. But first, before we do that, tell me a little bit about your choice to study further after you finished your degree at UCT. What was sort of behind that choice?
Yeah. And so, I always knew that I wanted to study further. The question was always a function of timing and when it took place. And so, because, for example, from a young age, I wanted to, let's say, apply for the Rhodes Scholarship, the one that I got to, that took me to Oxford. And so I knew that would enable further study, just because I remember, like, for undergrad, deciding on, like, where to study. I mean, there were some US universities that were interested in me coming abroad. But at the time, I was very fortunate to be at St. John's on a scholarship. My mother was a single parent, working for government. And I thought to myself, like, look, whilst I could go let's say abroad for undergraduate, the reality is that literally the amount of money to cost my mother to fly me back to come see her at home from when I was in the US would be more than she would have paid for school fees my whole time at St. John's. And so you never want to have that trade-off where, like, a parent's like, do I see my child or do I let them stay where they are? And so I was like, look, then I told myself, fine, get a good scholarship locally, and then for post-grad, try go abroad. And so I always knew I wanted to get there. I think for me, in terms of the timing, it was both, fortuitous and unplanned. But in the same vein, I think I couldn't have had it any better way. Because just for context and for everyone else is that I did my actuarial science, then worked for 2 years, and then went to do my postgrad in the UK. And what I found was actually that break of working in between was really valuable. One, because it gave me context to actually what's important in the world in terms of, because, I think typical, students, we want to get our firsts and get A's and C's for everything. But in doing that, you approach your work as an academic exercise, right? Like, you're learning because you want to enjoy the subject, but you also want to solve for the test and the exam. Whereas what I found was, after working, I was able to get a balance of, yes, you can do well in everything, but you can also be very specific around the kind of takeaways you want to get from a program. And so for me, I feel like that working piece at BCG and also G at Goldman Sachs was very helpful to help me crystallize and make sure I took away the right things. Because, for example, if I think about so my second master's at Oxford was focusing on technology, particularly within education and professional development. And it's a very theoretical course. I mean, like you go to the deepest Vygotskian like theories of, like, it's so deep in how you go. But I was able to bring a practical overlay to that, which then precipitated some of the thinking that informed the forming of Go1, because I was able to have the practical experience of having worked somewhere else. And so it was both intentional, but also rather unintentional.
And so if we dive into that, I want to talk about that little 2-year gap, right, between your time, you're finishing your undergraduate and starting your postgraduate. I actually want us to link this to your entrepreneurship journey, right? I want to understand how much that helped you in thinking about your entrepreneurship journey now, looking back in hindsight.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was speaking in a conversation yesterday, masterclass, and it was interesting where I think if it wasn't for my time in the 2 years corporate, I don't think I would be the entrepreneur that I am today. And I think it's something to mention. I think it's very easy. I think, I think of the times when, and I'll get to your question, but when I finished undergrad, if you went straight from undergrad starting your business, people would be like, you failed, like, don't worry, I've got my dad's CEO at this company, we can get you in, like, don't struggle, man, like, we can get you something. Whereas now, I find that entrepreneurship is very sexy and it's in. And everyone's like, oh, you're entrepreneur, oh man, I want to be you, man. I'm so jealous, I'd rather not take my, X million rand salary from the bank. I'd rather be an entrepreneur. I'm like, cool, man, you see. And I think there's definitely a romanticization around it. But definitely my 2 years, particularly being in spaces I found like banking and consulting, particularly management consulting at international firms where I think BCG as a company puts a very strong emphasis on developing its people because ultimately your people are your asset, which is something which I still believe in many industries and businesses as well. And just coming in and being a sponge when it came to learning was very important for me on my entrepreneurial journey, but also in terms of better seeing the pain points and the problems that I want to solve. And so some of the findings we'll get to now from a GoOn perspective were built on views that I experienced in my time at BCG, for an example, and even before then. And so sometimes you have to almost like live the experience. And so, like, for example, yesterday's conversation we're having with Adrian Gore, we was addressing was around like, look, if you think of his journey, he worked at Liberty and then saw the opportunity for what became, Discovery. And I think there's something to be said around one, using that gap to one, crystallize on your skill set, but also more importantly, deeper understand the problem you want to solve. And I think for me, those 2 years definitely serve that purpose.
And building into Go1, tell me about the inspiration behind the inception. So what was the main inspiration behind starting it?
Yeah, and so Go is an interesting one because one actually when it began, like our first learning product wasn't called Go1, it was called Aduro, which means spark in Latin, but then Aduro didn't scale in terms of a name and a spelling, and so we decided to flip back to Go1. And so it's interesting where I think the genesis of Go1 was a function of the different founding members in the business or founding executives having different experiences. And so, for example, mine was more born in during undergrad. I was an Alan Gray scholar and was very much inspired by Warren Buffett, Phil Fisher, and Alan Gray. So like deep value investors. And so a few friends and I came together and he pulled our scholarship money, convinced people to give us their money, and began investing. And we used to invest. We spent Friday nights in the library having investment committee meetings. And when some of the guys then began working for companies like Goldman Sachs and others, because of compliance, you couldn't trade anymore. You couldn't trade stocks. And so we began to invest in smaller businesses like venture capital, private equity, and so forth. And so what's interesting there was when you speak to those smaller businesses, those entrepreneurs said, look, their biggest challenge was finding the right people. Yet when you ask them how do they train their people, they said, no, they'll learn on the job. And so there wasn't a sense of like, how do you put together a structured learning environment for people? And so just for context for everyone, I realize in the conversation is Go1 as a company, what we do there is we help organizations train their staff through our online learning platform and our content hub. And so essentially today we're probably the world's largest online corporate training library and ecosystem. We bring together hundreds of thousands of courses from the best providers in the world, almost like a Spotify or Netflix for corporate training at that level. And so we offer that in a number of countries. But so just to the point where I was then, where in undergrad, working with these small companies that weren't investing in their staff because they thought they didn't have the money or the time, I then worked in management consulting, where often companies were paying us as consultants good amounts of money to often address problems that could have been resolved by them better investing in their staff consistently. And so just really the tools that we're using to address those development needs left much to be desired. And yet these are some of the biggest companies in the world with all the money, yet they weren't getting their training and development right. And so then when I got to the UK and got the Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, I then for my second year wanted to focus on almost like having the space to apply my mind around that particular problem. And so that's why I chose the MSc in Education, Learning, and Technology as a focus. And so that was my journey. But I guess in parallel, Andrew, one of my business partners and one of the co-founders, he had been building websites since high school. And so he and his high school friends had a web development company where they used to build websites out. And they were seeing, again, interesting requirements in the learning space because people were asking to build websites with learning requirements in it. And so at the time Andrew and I met, he was still very much had a decently sized web development business. And so after much gnashing of teeth and meeting with the team and because it's interesting because I met Andrew. So Andrew's an Australian, spoiler alert. And the South African and stuff, you can appreciate this because, growing up in South Africa, we were always taught to despise Australians, New Zealanders because of cricket and rugby. And so I was like, there's this guy, he's Australian. And our class was small, so you couldn't making enemies. But I was like, but he was really smart and he was a likable character. And so once we overcame our deep ingrained, let's call it national rivalries, just being able to get to know him as a friend and starting to share ideas around how we saw the learning space evolving and so forth, it became clear that we had similar views in terms of that. And so really it was that meeting of minds, but from different experiences, that then led to the genesis of Go1. And so, I mean, we launched the incorporated Go1 in 2015. And what one needs to remember is if you take the incorporation date of like Go1 as the initial entity, I mean, Andrew and I were still technically registered students in Oxford. And so we then obviously with these other partners in the web development business then came together as I guess the five of us as executives and then began to build out Go1. And so we then applied to a program in the US called Y Combinator, which is like a tech incubator. So some gave birth to the likes of Airbnb, Dropbox, Stripe, and a few other very large companies. So very well respected. And I remember, so there were like the five of us squatting it out in Mountain View in a 2-bedroom house, taking turns on the bedrooms. And even during that time, I remember like we used to literally procrastinate. So Andrew and I were still writing our dissertations. And literally like procrastinating. I used to procrastinate at night from studying, calling clients in South Africa and trying to like call organizations. And I literally remember like we submitted our dissertation probably 2 weeks before demo day, which is like the big final thing of Y Combinator, where you demo your product and where you are in your business to all the big investors. And so it was almost through those experiences. But when we began the business, we were just a learning management system. So you can almost think of a learning management system being a platform, a shell that you can use to deliver training, almost like a bookshelf. But a company still needs to buy the books and to curate the books and so forth. And so we won the award for one of the best learning platforms in the world when we launched, because it was the ease of use. Because what we discovered back then was that there were many software solutions actually out there, even applies outside of learning, but particularly in learning, where there were many LMSs or learning management systems out there. And to be honest, if I knew how many there were back then, I probably wouldn't have entered this industry. But, you know, when you're young and you don't know any better, you're like, you know, gung-ho, because there are literally like 3,000 of them out there. But I'm very glad to have won the award. But like I liken it to Microsoft Excel, where Excel is a very powerful tool, but for you to get the most value from it, like using, you know, VBAs, macros, all that good stuff, you need to be a super user. And so LMS are very powerful, but to get the most value, you have to almost be like a mini like computer scientist expert. And so for us, we said, how do you build an LMS that one shouldn't have to learn how to learn? And so focusing on the ease of use of the platform enabled us then to really create value and really create the power for our end organizations. So we began as a system, but over time what we realized was that everyone who buys a bookshelf is going to buy books. And so if we can help companies and individuals get those books, why not sell the books and the bookshelf, at least bring the books prepackaged? And so over that period of time, so when we started the business, I was focusing more on business development and sales, and then discovering that, and this is a small anecdote. So early as I was building up our sales teams and stuff, is you go to a client and demo the solution with like dummy content, dummy videos. And then you'd be like, when can we get started? They'll be like, oh no, we don't have any videos or content yet. Come back to us in 6 months. And literally your whole sales cycle was gone. And so what we realized over time was that there are two types of customers. Those that were content creators who'd use our platform to sell their content to people. So if you're a professional trainer, like a CETA creative provider, training people as a living, or you're a big company, let's say like Sasol and MTN, who would be buying training from these guys, but often outside our platform. So we almost created a marketplace where we could net off supply and demand for training content. And that then evolved into what we built out as our content library or content hub, where we began to aggregate training. So now we aggregate over 100,000 training items or content items from the best providers around the world, with the assumption that we want to give you the books for your bookshelf whenever you're thinking about learning.
I absolutely love that, and I think that's extremely inspirational. And a couple of little links that I'm seeing. I mean, you spoke a little bit about, you know, your decision to study actuarial sciences in terms of the fact that, you know, you're almost solving future problems, right? And solving your sort of problem solving mind and that desire to actually solve problems, I think is incredible, right? I think that is sort of manifested in how the business has grown and in terms of the values behind the business. But the second thing I think is in terms of, you know, the fact that, you know, companies need to actually invest in people first and foremost, and that's actually the best route to success is for them to actually invest in helping people become better. And I think, what you're providing is that solution for them, right? And I think and the principles behind that are incredibly inspirational as well. And I want to talk about, some of the challenges. What challenges did you, encounter in the inception, right? And I want to preface this question because I think sometimes, as you said, so like entrepreneurship right now, I think is the in thing. And I think a lot of people who haven't entered into it, right, have this perception that, they look at entrepreneurs like yourself and they seem to think that, okay, cool, I can get there tomorrow, right? And that, Melvyn's, growth was just, linear or even exponential, right? They don't realize that there's probably a lot of variation.
Oscillation around the mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a trend line rather than anything else. Mathematical. But I really want to talk about that reality here, and I think it's important for people to realize that. So tell me a little bit about some of the challenges and the realities of starting, something that is so significant, but that journey, that inception of that journey. What are the challenges that you encountered in that?
Yeah, it's a very valid point, and I mean, I think can anyone, and look, I'm very still much early on my journey, and so hopefully I have a lot more to go on that curve. I like that last curve you did there; it looked quite steep. I appreciate that. Thank you. So definitely it's a lot more to learn and do, but I think from my experiences so far, definitely, I think there's so many learnings. I think personal ones, and I think personal ones also ones which I think apply to business more broadly. And so, like personally, I think often you will be your biggest barrier to your success. And whether it's in your mindset, whether it's in your focus, there's so much which you can self-sabotage more than you realize. I remember coming out of even my time at Oxford, where I was thinking, I go back to management consulting, during banking, I had some offers I was looking at in the investment management space. And, you're thinking back then where my annual salary would have been 3 times what the revenue was in Go1. And you're and it's easy to be yeah, let me go take the sure bet. But it's all about saying look, I asked myself a simple question, right? Am I making the best use of the talents and skills I've been given in the spaces that I'm in? But also importantly, it's also a function of timing. And I felt look, I was at the point in my life, and I still believe I'm there now, where I can take that risk. And if push comes to shove and I zero base, I lose everything, I'll be confident that I could build up again to something at least that I'd be proud of and say I was able to pursue myself. And so for me, quite early on was more so those internal struggles around startup thing or flashy life you used to have. Because back in the day, in my consulting days, I worked in about 12 countries in 2 years. I mean, I was crushing it, flying business class, living in the top hotels. I was a cool kid. Now I'm there. Literally, we used to have the kitchen was our office. And we used to fight. We had the window and just different perspective altogether. And I think often, especially as young professionals, your ego will get in the way because people know you as, you're the smart guy in school or you were doing that first in your job. Now you're going out to being the entrepreneur. And the reality is you make sacrifices because in my businesses, when I start out, I want to make sure I'm the lowest paid person because I want to make sure that look, we're in it together, we're building, we're doing what we need to do. And so I think for me, it's often more mindset at the beginning, which is the toughest things to overcome. And also arguably ego and the perception and not caring about what people think, but more so about yourself. I think then when I go a level deeper into, the business itself, I think in business, things will always take longer than you think they will. And I mean, and that's just it is what it is. And I think you need to understand that in life, things will take time. But also what I found benefit is that there'll be highs and there'll be lows. And I think one thing which I have said, the benefit of having, I mentioned to you earlier, having strong teams, but I think in business, having strong business partners is that, when you're feeling down, your team member will be feeling up and vice versa. And just, because entrepreneurship can be a very lonely journey. And so some people can find that connection through their partners, through mentors. But often I think in the business space, just having a business partner who you're in a struggle with and you're both grinding is such a key thing. That being said, I think I never also had a strong appreciation for what a P&L and what cash flow means. I think, as a management consultant, you're unexposed to that kind of stuff more directly than a senior person. But I think definitely when, if you weren't doing certain things, if you weren't paying for electricity, it wasn't getting paid, the lights would go out. Whereas in the big business, things are paid, you rock up, you take out the laptop and you dominate.
Yeah, exactly.
Or even just thinking about cash flow, where you sign a very big client and you work with some very large clients early on. And the client hasn't paid you because corporates, let's say, have, 60-day or whatever, 90-day payment terms. And you're I'm good on paper, but I got to pay salaries on the 25th. Like, what's good? And so, funny enough, that was one of the insights that inspired the invoice factoring and discount business that we built out as Plus when I came back. But again, it's one of those things where things you just take for granted. But in the same vein, I think just having people to be responsible for and having a P&L, I would argue have been like the most career developing things business-wise. I think my fast forward or acceleration of business understanding, business thinking, and just understanding what it takes to build a business has been learned being in the trenches. Even though, yes, I did a business science, yes, I was in management consulting, but I think literally when you have people to report into you and actually like a business to build and an agency to do so, phenomenal. And I think you discount also how beneficial it would be. I think I discounted how good just being an entrepreneur would be for my business knowledge and understanding.
Love that. Absolutely love that. That is so profound and so powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about a topic that I know you are quite passionate about, and I'm very passionate about as well, which is technology and innovation in Africa's future, right? And before I preface, the topic, I actually want to get your take on, what is Africa's potential, and the future that, that technology and innovation has to play in that future.
Yeah. And so remember that curve that you showed us, which I think you're referring to. I think Africa's one's probably even steeper. I think just like the potential that, to your question, I think it's really unbounded. And that's just because I think Africa has so much working for it. And I think it's something which we discount. I mean, we have such phenomenal, natural resources across the board, beautiful land, good resources underground, in the air, and the waters, really. Like, I mean, some of like the world's biggest freshwater deposits and sources and bodies are in Africa. But in the same vein, we also have very powerful intellectual capital and human capital. Like something which, I mean, some of the most educated nations are in Africa. So fortunately, lots of people are in the diaspora. But in the same vein, just that intellectual muscle and capacity just to do things. And I think at that level, if we're able to apply both of those to problems that we face, and leveraging technology, I think the potential is unbounded. And so I think technology has a big room to play because to some extent we actually are blessed in that way because we don't have the bounded infrastructure that many of our, let's say, Western counterparts have. I mean, I always joke from my time in London where, the streets you're literally walking on, some of the cobble streets, were there from like the 1800s. I mean, literally, if you had an H2 Hummer, you wouldn't fit through those streets because they're so small because they're for horse and carriages. Whereas I feel like if I go to like, I don't know, the village in Uganda, I mean, there's no road. And so therefore you trailblaze your own way. And I think it's analogous just in terms of how raw technology can play, but also the opportunity that exists for entrepreneurs, young and old, to actually create solutions that are suitable to the African context. I mean, one of our portfolio companies which I've invested in is a quintessential example. So very smart individuals from Nigeria. Fortunate to be skilled in the UK, in the US. So MIT, Stanford graduates. They then came back home to Nigeria and realized that, like, look, the agricultural value chain is broken. And so all the tools that were there to, let's say, dehusk, like, nuts, for example, the kernels in a particular value chain were all built for a different type of nut, a nut that's typically found in Asia or in Europe. And so literally there was low productivity. And so what they did is, leveraging their experience and their engineering background, were able to retrofit and create like tools and processing tools for these certain African crops. And so I think just being able to, again, leverage technology, and this is harder even more than software, to solve African problems, so allow them to increase efficiency by more than 300% of what's currently happening in the market, and they're scaling quite aggressively across Nigeria. And so I think the same thing goes across even just general technology and having that innovation mindset where your starting point is not necessarily how is this problem currently being solved, but given this is the problem, from first principles, what's the best way this can be solved, as opposed to being constrained by what the current approach is.
Absolutely love that. And, if I did say I'll preface this topic, so I'm going to do that now, right? So the African Union's Agenda 2063, is a document that pretty much pertains to exactly what we're talking about, which is Africa's future and the potential for that future. And one of the things that it talks about is a prosperous Africa, based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And two of the goals that underpin that are that of a skills revolution, right? So through science and technology, and transform economies as well. So I guess firstly, right, and this is a three-part question. So firstly, how possible do you think this is by 2063? So AU, or the African Union, as it were, has this agenda to achieve this by 2063. So, and then secondly, how do you think we approach this in a multidisciplinary form? So obviously one arm is inclusive growth, and the other arm is, sustainable development. And within that, you need the sort of skills revolution, right, through science and technology, and you also need the transformed economies as a result. And, the two sort of work hand in hand, as it were. So how do you think we approach that in a multidisciplinary form? And thirdly, what are the baby steps? Because I think sometimes we can think, too far ahead to say, okay, no, we need to transform Africa tomorrow. We need to take these massive steps. I want to talk more about the baby steps as well.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think it hits the nail on the head where, I think a multidisciplinary approach is the only approach that will be successful. And we can have the philosophical debates around other approaches, but the reality is a multidisciplinary approach is an inclusive approach. Because if you're able to bring fresh thinking to a problem and able to, again, be able to rally and make it inclusive by bringing on different viewpoints, different perspectives, different approaches, yes, in a constructive and congruent way so that the ultimate vision is not necessarily missed, I think you get the best outcomes. It's one of the key drivers why, when, to your question earlier, even though I have a background in commerce and very much in the business space, I was intentional about studying a master's in public policy at Oxford for my first degree because I wanted to understand that different approach to solving a problem at that particular scale. And so I think it definitely does require that multidisciplinary approach. I think what the key thing there is then how do you ensure that, one, I think coordination and collaboration, which I think is where the AU and other similar bodies play an important role, almost being that unifying point, almost like the owner of the agenda, not necessarily the one that owns on delivery, but owns on the coordination. And I think it is right where, and look, we can look to many examples around like development, where you can say like, look, fine, look what Singapore did back then or Malaysia. And I mean, there are many theories around and case studies around how like they did well. And I think, look, similar to the point you mentioned, in terms of like, when you're discussing earlier on the importance of impactful conversations, being able to hear someone's story and take away elements relevant to your journey. And I think it's important for us to learn from people around the world, to learn from each other as a continent and as countries on the continent, and be able to take the best parts relevant to us and almost blend that into our growth path and our journeys. And I think it's quite important for us to take that approach. And so I think to your question, is it attainable? I'm an eternal optimist. I think with the right amount of focus and commitment, I think it is possible. And by no means is it a small task. I think that's the point you mentioned where, you have to walk before you run. If you try stand and run, you'll trip. And so I think it's one of those things where you want to be able to know what does success look like, not only in 20 years, but what does success look like next year? What does success look like tomorrow? And so something which I used to put up on our company inside our company walls was an equation which essentially showed two equations. So one was 1.00001 to the power of 365, and then 0.99999 to the power of 365, and just how after 365 days in a year, what the outsized impact is of just putting in that extra bit each day and compounding versus going backwards. And I think if you have very defined goals, and I think inclusive goals, where everyone's able to leverage their skills, their understanding, and their experience for that objective, you'll definitely get there. But I do think it does require intention, and it does require leadership in achieving that. And I think it's easy to have a summit once a year, but what are our governments, what are we as citizens, what are we as business leaders doing in how we make decisions every day that further that ambition and that vision?
And I absolutely love what you said there, because it's going to have to be a focused approach, right? It's going to have to be an extremely focused approach. We we cannot get there by straying wayward off that path, for 5 years and then, trying to come back. We're all going to have to be extremely focused to transform this. And see, so I want to ask you a question that was brought up, by one of our listeners who submitted a question in before the episode, and it's more of a very specific scenario, right? And it leads to sort of the next topic, which we'll talk about, which is around digital transformation. But so the listener says, I joined the workforce over a little over a year ago, and I'm already in my second job. And one thing that's for certain is that very much likely to. So when you join into the workforce or into a job, you're very much likely to undergo some kind of training. Different companies have different systems, and we'll obviously have to train individuals on specific systems. But what I've realized is that most fields have some common factors within the field, right? So you get accounting graduates from 4 different companies doing the same Excel onboarding course, and after joining their respective companies. So which got me thinking, and this is the listener, not me, I can't take credit for this thought, which got me thinking that I guess I would like to hear your take on this. Are universities going along with the times? Are they sending off graduates equipped for today's workplace and the necessary skills for that? And my thinking is that continuously changing the syllabus to suit a continuously changing world would be a bit of a hassle. So do you think access to e-learning resources where students can take courses on skills that will better equip them for the industry they're planning on joining is a good idea? So that's a fully loaded question, but a question nonetheless.
And it's a meaty one. I think it's a important one. I think it's also born out of the experiences, I think, of the individual there. And so I'm an e-learning bull, obviously, because that's my industry, but I also don't think e-learning in and of itself is a panacea to everything. And so at that level, it's one of those things whereby I think definitely, yes, can there be supplementary training that enables to bridge the gap between, let's say, university and the world of work? Definitely. And I think that could even be offered in a university setting. I mean, that's where I'd like, for example, the doctor or the medicine profession, where before you hit the real world, you actually have years in practice exposing to certain skill sets. But in the same vein, you're right. I think that there's certain things so we work with many large corporates here in South Africa and abroad on graduate programs. So almost programs that help upskill graduates as they, for example, enter the world of work. And so at that level, you then think through how does one actually enable people to have those skill sets that equip them regardless of where they're in. So that could be empathy, showing a personal brand. A big one is Excel, as an example. And so just being able to leverage those are very valuable to assist that. And so I think it definitely is possible to bring e-learning into that equation. And I think more effort can be applied to almost have base case skills. Almost think about the US, where there's almost a liberal arts degree, and then you do the specific stuff. I think that could be applied somewhat to the graduate space as well.
And I think you've answered a very difficult question very well. I've always told my guests that the listeners always often ask very difficult questions. So very well done for answering that one. But finally, Melvyn, I want to touch on a little bit on digital transformation and the role that this has to play in the future of technology and innovation in South Africa. And in this, I want to ask you a two-pronged question, which is how do we make sure that this digital transformation in a South African sense is inclusive in all parts of our economy, and what role do you think government has to play within this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one where I think so the government always has a key role to play in these sort of things, and I think it's almost where does government's role stop? And I think it's very easy to be we pay our taxes, therefore the government must do everything. In terms of setting the agenda, delivering on the agenda, tracking the results, and then and I think it's almost I think the role of government generally, and even in this context here, is more around the creating an enabling environment for it. Exactly. And so whether that is in creating the right incentives for individuals or public sector actors to come to the table, almost creating the rules of the game, so they may not necessarily provide the medals at the end of the game or the soccer ball, but they can provide the rules that enable the soccer game to take place. And I think that's the role government can play at a base case. I think depending on philosophical views, socialism versus not, the different roles government can play. But for me, at a base case, I think that needs to be true. And so I think in that way, I think even think about innovation and technology where government can play a role. And I think about the US example with think about, GPS or the internet, how these were actually government funded military things, which then found a public good outside of the military. And I think there's certain catalytic things that the government can play in enabling those sorts of things by very targeted investments. And so that's often, I think, and so some of the work I do now, I advise one of the ministers here in South Africa in the digital technology space. And again, it's about saying, how do you best use the fiscus to catalyze the transformation you want in the economy? And I think that's where it comes down to being very specific and making very specific choices. But also, it's important to have conversations between citizens, government, and private sector, because the reality is, if government thinks that by doing X, someone will do Y, but you never told them that that's what you expect, or ask them if they do that, you may have very funny outcomes.
Yeah. And I think that's extremely insightful, and thank you for that. Melvyn, I want to thank you so much for coming on to episode 20 of Impactful Conversations. I think it's been an amazing chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to your answer. What has been some, I think, really thought-provoking questions that I think the listener can take away and really think deeply about. So I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. I know you're an extremely busy man, so this is a nice excuse for the two of us to also catch up as well. Right? So I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. I look forward to welcoming you back in the future. Thank you so much, and I hope that I hope this has also been reflective. Often the guests tell me that this has been a very reflective episode as they sort of reflect back on their journey as well. So it's added value to you as well in that sense.
No, definitely. And thank you very much for the invitation. I think Impactful Conversations is, I think, at its core, at least its mission, is definitely one which I support. I think is very valuable. I think has been missing in the discourse for a long time, and so very honored to be able to contribute to that. And also thank you to your listeners for listening in and giving us the time and joining us on this reflective journey as well.
Awesome. And to you, the listener, thank you very much for joining us on episode 20. We hope that you've enjoyed this. So stick around for the next few episodes that are coming up. Do subscribe if you're listening on podcast or if you're listening on YouTube. And send us your thoughts. So you go to impactfulconversations.co.za and hit the contact us button and send us your thoughts and what you thought, on how the episode impacted you. It's always lovely to hear from you. And thank you so much for supporting this, for sharing it with your circles, and for being impacted and being inspired to change your community. And that's it from us. So thank you very much and goodbye.